Pro-American and corporate media have been ratcheting up their hostility towards the Venezuelan government, calling Nicolás Maduro a dictator. But is he really? Since Maduro's election, the opposition has tried many things to try to remove him from office, including a recall referendum. But the referendum was not carried out because of accusations of voter fraud. American and corporate media immediately called this the end of democracy in the country, as if it's simply impossible that there was anything irregular about the vote. It's a strange accusation coming from Americans, or really almost anyone else, since Venezuela is one of the few countries in the world that actually has a right to recall their president. It was put into the Constitution after Hugo Chávez's assumption of power in 1999 by a constituent assembly, and has only been used against Chávez himself. Another common accusation is that Maduro carried out a coup by dissolving the National Assembly and usurping its powers into the top court, the Supreme Tribunal of Justice. The Western media reported this as if Maduro just arbitrarily decided one day he didn't want the opposition-led legislature to exist anymore, so he just took their powers for himself. But the roots of the constitutional crisis go all the way back to the last legislative election of 2015. The opposition coalition Democratic Unity, or MUD, won the election, but 4 legislators from the Amazonas region were accused of vote buying by the TSJ and asked not to take their seat until the tribunal could investigate. One of the legislators from the ruling PSUV complied with the court order, but the other 3 from the opposition MUD refused. Since then, the National Assembly has constantly flouted the tribunal's decision and tried to bring them back in. The TSJ declared that any decisions made by a National Assembly in contempt of their order would be null, and the TSJ has since took it upon themselves to pass the decisions instead of the legislature. Some have called this unconstitutional, which is debatable. Article 336 of the Constitution does give the tribunal the authority to declare something the Legislative Assembly does is unconstitutional and correct it, but the Constitution is not explicit on how this is done. While it's certainly not good for democracy for one branch of the government to usurp the powers of another, one has to wonder, why don't the opposition legislators just comply with the ruling? The one PSUV legislator already has, which brings the PSUV's caucus down to 55 seats, compared to MUD's 112, which would go down to 109. While this would lose them the supermajority they need to replace judges or remove the vice president, they would still have a strong majority they can use to do almost anything else. So why would the opposition prefer having no power at all right now, rather than losing these 3 seats? Could it be because they only care about removing government-loyal Chavistas from office? Are they trying to provoke a constitutional crisis in order to undermine the administration's legitimacy? After all, it's not like the opposition is known to play by the rules. For all the talk of Maduro attempting a coup against the legislature, opposition groups have certainly been guilty of at least 2, if not 3, coup attempts against the PSUV government. Clearly, the opposition sees popular elections and legal procedures as only one of many avenues to power in their quest to overthrow the government by any means necessary. The divide between the government and opposition has reached a high point this year, with both camps holding their own elections. After the Maduro government decided to call for a constituent assembly to change the constitution in the hopes of ending the crisis, the opposition held an unofficial referendum on the calling of the Constitutional Assembly. Since the referendum had no legal effect, hardly anyone outside of the opposition bothered to show up for the vote. This allowed the American media to report a 99% mandate to cancel the Constituent Assembly and stick with the old constitution. The Constituent Assembly is also accused of being stacked with government loyalists, which is not surprising since the opposition didn't even bother to run in it, deciding to boycott it instead. Another common accusation made against the PSUV government is that it's committing acts of police brutality and political repression against dissidents. We often hear about dozens of people being killed in clashes with the police. What we don't often hear is that more deaths have been attributed to opposition violence rather than police and state repression. The opposition has been ramping up their activity in the past year or so. They now regularly engaged in armed civil disobedience, including barricading major highways, destroying food reserves, including 50 tons of food, and intentionally provoking police with homemade rockets and explosives and projectiles. Opposition gangs have been known to brutally lynch and murder anyone suspected of supporting the government, which often means poor black Venezuelans. Outright terrorism has also been seen, and the latest wave of resistance includes throwing a grenade at a courthouse. None of this justifies any retaliatory attacks on innocent civilians, but there have been arrests and prosecutions of police officers guilty of attacking protesters, so the idea of Maduro as a mad dictator sicking his thugs on innocent civilians is largely contrived and one-sided. This lack of context also allows the media to portray the government as being repressive towards opposition leaders. American pundits and politicians, including Trump himself, have called for Leopoldo Lopez to be released from prison, as if it's simply preposterous that he might have any responsibility for the violent protests he was encouraging. The government is also frequently accused of totalitarian censorship and not allowing any freedom of the press, despite the fact that anti-government editorials and interviews with opposition leaders are regularly featured on private media. Ironically, the US has far less diverse points of view on Venezuela, since all major American news outlets uncritically repeat the opposition's talking points. And they do so for a clear reason, because the American ruling class wants regime change in the country. We've seen this pattern of propaganda and one-sided reporting before, especially in Latin America. During the 80s, the Ronald Reagan administration desperately tried to discredit the Sandinista government any way they could, all the while ignoring the fact that his own death squads were committing far worse atrocities in the country. Many people are rightfully concerned about the political crisis, heavy-handed actions by the government, and increasingly dangerous street violence. But the corporate media and US-aligned governments only tell half of the story, leaving out the fact that these are actions taken by a government under attack from a violent foreign-backed opposition. The US government time and time again has supported and financed the overthrow of any government that they don't like. It happened in Guatemala, it happened in Chile, it happened in Nicaragua, and now with the $50 million the Venezuelan opposition is getting from the US, they're trying to do it again. Are we going to allow that to happen? Viva la revolución!